Hello, daughters of the American Revolution. My name is Lisa Shoemaker, and I have been in DAR since 2010. I have been asked today to talk to you about historic preservation. And one of my favorite places to visit is Mount Vernon, which is the home of George Washington. It has been restored and preserved by an organization called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. But before I get into that, I wanted to give you a little background and history of the Washingtons. So when George was just 11 years old, his father passes away. And at this time, there was a property, a small house, about 4 rooms with a central passage, 1 story, called Little Hunting Creek. And it went to George's older half-brother, Lawrence. So when Lawrence gets a hold of the property, he decides to change the name to Mount Vernon, and that is in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, who was his commander while he served in the Virginia Foot Regiment. So Lawrence only has the house for a short time before he passes away, and then it goes into the hands of his wife. And she lives there until she remarries, and then, because she has no need for the house, but she leases it to George at that time. And then she ends up passing away in 1761, and that is when George inherits the house. He's about 29 at the time that he inherits the house. Now, George meets Martha when he's 27. Martha's a 26-year-old widow with 2 children. She had been married to a very wealthy Virginian named Daniel Parke Custis, and together they had 4 children. The first 2 children passed away, and then her husband passed away. So she meets George, and she's got 2 small children. They get married, and George very happily becomes a father to the children. And by all accounts that we've read about, the children and the grandchildren all absolutely loved George. So he was a very good stepfather, step-grandfather. He also ends up raising his Martha's 2 grandchildren. George never had children of his own. And you have to remember, back in that time, children, the likelihood of them growing up to see adulthood was a little bit slimmer than it is now. They say about only 60% actually probably made it to the age of 20. So Martha's children's name were John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis. And the Park is in there because it was a condition of one of the wealthy great-grandfathers that the children, the grandchildren, and so on must have Park in the name in order to inherit the money. So that is why the Park is in there. Now, John was nicknamed Jackie, and Martha was nicknamed Patsy. Now, after George and Martha get married, it's a couple years before he acquires Mount Vernon. But once he does, Mount Vernon is a project that he takes on and decides to enlarge, and he spends his whole life creating the Mount Vernon that he wants. So he's eventually going to expand it by a 2nd story plus a garret, which is another name for attic, and then he'll eventually add on the 2 wings that are on the side and all the different outbuildings, the place where they kept the plants during the winter months, all kinds of things. Now, unfortunately, when Patsy, Martha's 3rd child, when she turned 17, she passes away from a seizure. And today we think that seizure was probably epilepsy. So now Martha has lost 3 children. Well, George goes off to war, so he's been asked to lead and be the general of the Revolutionary War, so he's going to be away for 8 years. And much of that time while he's away, Martha does go to camp and spends time with him. She's there to kind of host the officials. She's also there to write correspondence and knit for the soldiers, and she does keep up the morale. They enjoy having her there. Now, near the end of the war, their son Jackie decides to join up, and he ends up at Yorktown, and he passes away of camp fever. So now Martha has lost all 4 of her children. At the time that Jackie had passed away, he was married and he had 4 children. Now, for some reason, Martha ends up raising the two younger children. We don't really know the reason why that is. Perhaps it was because she was so heartbroken, her daughter-in-law felt sorry for her, or would it be harder for her daughter-in-law to get married with 4 children? We don't really know the answer, but for whatever reason, we know that they were the delight of Martha's eyes. She loved those grandchildren so much. And the other children and her daughter-in-law were welcome at Mount Vernon, anytime. In fact, I think they were there quite a bit. So she did have a very good relationship with her daughter-in-law as well. So the 2 grandchildren that Martha and George raise are Nellie and Washi. It was George Washington Parke Custis and Eleanor Parke Custis. But they nicknamed them. Must have been a common thing to do back then. So we have Washi and Nellie, and they were the delight of their eyes. So now we know George was away, while he was at war. And again, he's going to be away for another 8 years serving as President of the United States. And remember, in his presidency, he served in New York and Philadelphia. Washington, D.C. was selected after his presidency by him, but he never served in Washington, D.C. So all the time that he's away, he has a trusted overseer that is doing the projects on Mount Vernon. And, so they're corresponding quite frequently. And of course, the labor is done by his enslaved people. So George, after he retires from the presidency and he goes home, and he's so looking forward to being at Mount Vernon because Mount Vernon is his love and his passion. And he gets home and he's only there for a couple years before he passes away. He's 67 when he passes away. He had gone out one cold December afternoon checking on the properties and stuff, and he comes back in and he's complaining of a sore throat. And he ends up in bed, and he ends up actually dying the next day, and they called it Quincy. So this is 1799 when he passes away. Martha's going to pass away in 1803, and some say she died of a broken heart. But after Martha passes away, the house is going to go into the hands of a nephew, Bushrod Washington. He passes away, then it goes to Augustine, and then finally to Augustine II. When Augustine II has it, he is not able to afford the upkeep on it. So he makes a proposal to the government, why won't you buy this house? This is the first president's house, and he wants to sell it to them. And they're like, no, we're not interested. So there's this woman who has traveled up and down the Potomac River all her life, and she's always admired Mount Vernon. In fact, when boats would drive by Mount Vernon, they would toot the horn or whatever it is that they have. But anyway, she started noticing that the house was becoming in shambles and such a mess. And so she writes a letter to her daughter, and her daughter's name is Anne Pamela Cunningham. And in this letter, she says, if the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero to go to ruin, why can't the women of America band together and save it? So this is 1853. So her daughter actually takes this to heart, and she decides to do some fundraising and form an organization. And the organization is going to be called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And they finally raised $200,000 by 1858 to purchase the home. Now the home is purchased on the condition. Now, actually, the home that they purchased the home in 200 acres where there was originally like 4,000 acres. But John Augustine Washington says, the condition is that you allow the descendants to be buried at Mount Vernon. And so, sure, no problem with that. So they purchased the home, and then the Civil War breaks out. So got a lot going on. And during the Civil War, the soldiers automatically, on either side of whether you were a Confederate or Union, they just were very respectful to Mount Vernon and paid their respects. And there are some trees on the property that have initials carved in by soldiers and things like that. So that's kind of neat. So anyway, she wrote an editorial in the newspaper to help with fundraising, and they never did accept any, and never have accepted any money from the government. So all the funds that are raised to protect and preserve Mount Vernon are strictly from donations, ticket sales, gift shop, things like that. And you also have to remember that the women formed this organization at a time where women did not serve on corporate boards. So this was kind of a remarkable thing that they did. Now today, what they have done, well, the goal was to restore it to 1799, which is the year that George Washington passed away. And over the years, they've been able to collect items from descendants of the Washingtons and the Custuses. So there's a good percentage of items in the home that are original. And when you do a walkthrough tour of the home, a lot of times the docents will point that out, or you can ask the question. But they have found through the years, through more, they've gotten more accurate about things. Like at one time they thought it looked like this, and now they've discovered, no, it looked like this. So they really are striving to get it accurate. They do archaeological digs on the property all the time, which is kind of neat if you're there and they're working on something like that. What they maintain is the estate and the property, the gardens. There's like 2 formal gardens by the house. One is more of a vegetable garden and the other is more of a decorative garden. Of course, they've got crops and things like that growing as well. There's a historic area with the slave quarters, the blacksmith shop, the overseer quarters, the wash house, the carriage house. So there's all kinds of different outbuildings. And near the Potomac River, you'll find the Pioneer Farm, which is where they're talking about, or they're demonstrating some of the experimental things that George Washington was trying to do. And one of the things that he did was he created a treading barn, and it was on one of the other farm properties, but they've put it on this property so that you can see it. They've recreated it. And what it was a round barn where you had 2 levels. So you would put the wheat on the floor, and it's a circular barn. And so the horses are going around in circle, walking and treading on the wheat. And so the little kernels fall through the floor. And then they've got a whole system of how they get the straw and everything. They do demonstrations there. It's quite fascinating. They also have a distillery. So near the end of his life, he had a whiskey distillery, and they think it was probably one of the largest whiskey distilleries at the time. They made a lot of money off of fishing out of the Potomac River as well. You will experience the tombs on the property. There are 2 tombs. There's the old tomb and the new tomb. The new tomb was in his will to be completed. He wanted to complete a new tomb, but never got around to it. So they disinterred the bodies from the old tomb and put them into the new tomb. And if you go visit, you can see both of them. So the new tomb was just created 30 years after his death. So there are other family members that are buried there as well. Now they also have great exhibits in the Education Center. There is a museum, and which has got fabulous exhibits inside, but there's also the Education Center is more of a hands-on exhibits. There's films in there. There's a 4D film of the war, which the chairs will shake and it snows on you. There's smaller films in there about different things. There's an activity called Be Washington, where you will go in and you're in kind of like the situation room where you're trying to decide what's the best way to go forward in different war situations. So it's very, also the teeth are in that room, or in that, the Education Center too. And no, they weren't wooden. I think everybody probably knows that by now. But yes, they did come from some of his slaves and maybe other people and even animals. So That is a myth, of course, about the wooden teeth. Also the myth about him chopping down the tree, which is more of a propaganda thing to try to promote honesty in the presidency. So anyway, they've also built a library. I think it was 2015, and it's a separate building, but it's for scholarly study. So anybody who wants to study up on Washington can go into this library. You cannot check a book out, but you can do it. You can, see first accounts of, documents and things like that. Very interesting, and they have seminars and stuff in there as well. So Mount Vernon is very, very well done. It is a huge gift shop also, of course, which is important because we want to keep Mount Vernon going. So all you shoppers get out there and shop. But it wasn't without struggles. If you've been to Mount Vernon, you'll know on the back veranda there is a beautiful view of the Potomac River, and across from it is just gorgeous. They have had to fight off different businesses from wanting to put things in. Like in the 1950s, they were wanting to put in an oil farm. And so there was a congresswoman, her name is Frances Bolton from Ohio. So she goes in and she buys like 485 acres. And then, of course, she gives it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And then they were troubled again in the 1960s when a sewage treatment wanted to go in over there. So President John F. Kennedy steps in. He enacts a law to create Piscataway Park to protect another several hundreds of acres. Today, they have about 5,000 acres all along the shoreline, and I think it's maybe 6 miles of it. So it's still, there's still possibilities of threats coming in. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep the view looking the same way that George had when he sat out on that veranda. So they've done a phenomenal job, and I encourage everybody to go to Mount Vernon if you haven't been there. It is a beautiful place to visit. I hope you enjoyed learning a thing or two about George Washington, Mount Vernon, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So as you can see, without the efforts of the historic preservation by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, we wouldn't quite have the knowledge that we have about George Washington and how he lived his life. So as David McCullough quoted, history is who we are and why we are the way we are. So I hope you enjoyed learning about historic preservation through the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Thank you. Bye.